So I was just finishing up a job and on my way home when I realized I had gotten a voicemail from a customer that I had done many different jobs for. And when I called him back, he said he needed some help with a kitchen shelf that had broken and needed me to come over there and see what I could do to solve it. And so I was able to go there the next day, and I found out they had had a lot of pots and pans and plates and lots of kitchen items on this shelf, and it had actually broken. It had a metal support underneath it, and it had pulled away from that. It had pulled the screws out, and he was wanting to see if it could be repaired. And when I got there, I was able to see that it was made of fiberboard, also known as MDF. So it wasn't real wood, and that was probably part of the reason that those screws were able to pull away from it. It had this metal bar underneath it that helped support it, but once the weight got too heavy, it basically just kind of came apart. And so I was pretty much immediately able to see that this was not something where I was going to be able to use some other methods, like sometimes you can put some toothpicks and you can put some other pieces of wood back in the holes and try to re-secure things. But because it wasn't real wood, that wasn't going to be an option in this case. And so whenever I am in a situation like this where I know I'm looking at something that's going to take a number of steps and I'm having to explain the price and what's going on, I always make sure to tell the customer and frame it in that way that the price is going to reflect the steps of what it's going to take to actually get this done. And so I was letting him know that this basically meant we were going to need to recreate this shelf. I was going to need to go buy some new wood. And that was really the only way that we were going to be able to get this secure again, especially since he was wanting to put all of these heavier items on it. Now, another factor that is kind of a behind the scenes type of scenario with a job like this is there really is some pressure on the behalf of the person doing the work, that being me, because I don't know how expensive these items are, these different kitchen items are, the plates, the different type of pots and pans. I don't know what kind of sentimental value that there could be attached to it. And so there really is a lot of unique pressure you feel in a situation like this, because you better not bring back a shelf that's going to break, and then who knows what's going to happen to these very cherished items, right? And so that's a part that a lot of times gets missed when these jobs are getting done. That's that kind of behind the scenes pressure that can be a part of this to make sure that everything goes according to plan. And that also motivates and influences the decisions that you make and how you're going to repair it. And so the first step was I needed to take this shelf to the paint store to get a paint match. And so I got it to the back of my truck and removed the metal piece and those screws, because I definitely needed those screws and needed to make sure I didn't lose any of those parts or pieces. And so I got those in Ziploc bags, got it to the paint store for them to do the paint batch. And then I went to the hardware store to get the piece of wood that I was going to cut. Now, when I looked at the options, it basically turned out that to get a solid piece of oak was only maybe $10 or $20 more than any of the other types of options near it. And knowing that we really needed to have strength and knowing the importance of why we were doing this repair, I definitely opted to get that solid piece of oak. And so this was something I was going to work on at my house, complete all the steps there, and when I got it done, I was going to take it back. So the first step was to get the old shelf and measure it and get the exact size. And this was going to be really important because one unique thing about this shelf was it had some shelf pins underneath that were holding the shelf that were designed in such a way that they actually had a hole that they fit into on the bottom of the shelf. So it wasn't just a normal shelf pin that was just a straight edge that it sat on. It also had this piece that stuck up that was designed to actually fit into the shelf. So it needed to have these holes, and those holes were going to have to be in the exact same place in order for this to fit back in correctly. And so getting that first measurement was really going to be important, because if you get a little bit off, that could change your measurement on one side or the other, and it could change where those holes ended up being. Then you do all this work and you bring it back, and the slightest little thing can cause it to not end up fitting back in there. So I knew I really needed to take my time with these steps. I got that measurement cut. And next I brought it into the garage. I looked at some of the dips and gouges that were in the natural piece of wood, and I filled those in with caulking and got those smoothed out so that it would have a nice smooth look to it. And then once that dried, I decided to go ahead and at least get a rough idea of where these holes were going to be. So I wanted to get that step out of the way. So I first laid the old shelf on top of it. I put some clamps, and I just drilled right through where those previous holes were, just so that I could ensure that I was getting the exact placement. And I didn't get the exact depth set yet on that. I just wanted to get the rough idea of where those were going to be. And then I drilled the holes for the metal piece that was going to go on it. Because before I started painting, I just wanted to have that peace of mind of knowing I have all of those holes where they need to be, and I'm going to be all set there. So once I got that step done, I started to move on to the paint. Now this was winter time, and if it had been summertime, then I might have explored the idea of using a spray gun on this outside. But when you have a task this small, it's a gamble trying to find out what is the better use of your time, whether you're going to set up a gun and get it set up outside and then tear down the gun and all of the steps it's going to take to do that versus just rolling it. Because going through the steps of rolling it can be kind of a time-consuming process. And because it was winter time, I decided to just go the route of rolling the paint on. So I started with primer and got the primer on it. And then really for the next day after that, about every hour, I was coming out to the garage and adding a coat of paint until I had 2 coats of paint on each side and everything was looking good. So even that right there took basically a full day because of how I had to spread it out and complete those steps back and forth, waiting for it to dry, coming back, completing the next step, and so forth. And so eventually all the paint was dry, and I was ready to now do the final depth settings for these holes for this unique shelf pin to fit into. And so I used some tape to mark on the drill how deep the drill was going to be able to go so that I didn't actually drill through the piece of wood. And so I was able to complete that step. And then I went ahead and screwed the metal piece on. And I could just feel how solid this was now. On top of it being a solid piece of oak, screwing that metal piece to the top of it and feeling that extra security there, I could just tell this was going to be many, many times stronger than the shelf that had been there before. And so now this is on to the third day where it's now time to bring this back. And that's something worth noting, for a job like this that is so simple, seemingly, right? From the request standpoint, you then go through all the steps and you realize everything that has had to have been gone through to actually get this done. And then on top of that, then you got to drive it back, right? You started with driving there to get it, then you go to the paint store and then you complete all the steps and then you got to drive it back. And so even though this is something that seems so simple from the request standpoint, this is quite an involved job from the amount of steps that you have to take on. And so this last step was to then bring it back to the customer, and I had wrapped it in a blanket, gotten it in the back of my truck, and when I got in there, fortunately, everything lined up the way it should have been. And that was all due to thinking about that moment when I was going to have to put it back in and making sure that everything was going to line up the way that it was supposed to. And so fortunately, those shelf pins fit in right where they should have been. There weren't any surprises because sometimes there can be other factors that even though you do everything you can to think all of the potential issues through, sometimes there can be one little thing that causes a reason why something can't fit back in like the old piece did. And fortunately, nothing like that happened in this case. I let the customer know, hey, we've got a piece of solid oak wood here, and he was really happy to see that this was going to be a much better solution. And I'm glad I went that route because even though I had kind of recommended, it might not be a good idea to put all of these things back on the shelf. I kind of had the feeling that that's what they were going to do anyway. And so this was among one of the strongest options we could have gone with. And I was glad I decided to get that piece of oak and just make sure that we got the strongest thing in there that we could. And so the customer was happy, I was happy, and I was then able to relax a little bit and work on some personal projects until it was time for the next job. I show creatives how to get paid to do jobs just like this so they can become their own funding source and have the money and free time they need to pursue their artistic interests. I break it all down at cashcowartist.com. The link is in the description.